welcome back to Channel Water. Today we're going to talk about the first philosopher, Thales, which is the father of philosophy, science, and math as we know it today. And when I studied philosophy, of course, that's the first person you learn about. But what was so interesting in finding out about Thales and his philosophy is that it all had to do with water. And his philosophies and understanding of the world connect so strongly with what we talk about here in Channel Water. The reason we see Thales as the first philosopher is because he took phenomena that before were explained as through mythology, as the gods doing certain things within this world, and understanding it through their stories, into an understanding of our physical environment and the way we do it today in a scientific matter, where we look at our environment and the matter around us, and we try to explain things that are happening in a logical way. The most famous example of Thales' explanations of natural phenomena was for earthquakes. So he thought that all of our land, that basically Earth, was floating on water, and that Earth was flat and the continents were floating within and on that ocean. So he explained that the reason we had earthquakes was because the continents would move as they float on the ocean, and when they hit each other, that will create earthquakes and movements. So even though he was wrong in one aspect of understanding how the world is shaped and understanding Earth as a planet in space, the way that he explained his logic was very site-specific to the conditions and everything he saw around him. He didn't attribute any of the reasons to a god or some mythological story, and that was really the beginning of explaining the world through science and through logic. So philosophy is logical, but it's also bound by what we know at the time and the limitations we have. So at the time, there was no microscopes, and we haven't been to space yet, so we were not able to see the shape of the Earth. So even though he was wrong about the shape of the Earth, he was right within the limitations of what he knew. So within what he saw and understood, he created a theory that could make sense, which is something that we do today too. A lot of times within our science, we create theories that make sense until we discover more information about that subject. So today we think about the Earth being flat as a conspiracy theory and something that we run away from. But at the time, that was what people thought the Earth was. When you have no ability to see it from afar, and you only have your personal experience walking on a flat Earth that is always surrounded by an ocean, all the continents are surrounded by an ocean, you think, well, maybe we are an island floating on a flat ocean. The more interesting part of his work for me was his search for the origin of life, for the arche, for what I see as the continuum. He was trying to find the one thing, the essence of all things, where all matter and life came from. And he was trying to find it in a physical way, within the physical world, within what we can see and touch. If we look at the word arche, it means origin, source, beginning, ruler, source of action, element, the first principle. And this is what Thales is known for claiming that water is the principle of the element of things. All things are water. So for Thales, his conclusion, and we will go over why he made that conclusion, he thought that basically the ocean that we're floating on is the source of all things, and water had the ability to change into matter all the matter that is around us, and is also the force of life that allows life to grow and change and manipulate matter into all the living beings that we know of. Thales thought that under all of life, if you break it down, you will find one substance, a certain singularity within matter. And even today, when we think about concepts of God or consciousness, we think of it if it was in the material world, the representation will be of oneness, something that is a continuum that you cannot reduce it to anything else. That is basically your 0 point. And from that, everything else comes about. You can build it up into a big diversity, because that's what Thales saw. He saw the diversity of life, but he was trying to see, when you break down that diversity, what do we go back to? What is that arche? What is the continuum of life? So on his search for this arche, for this continuum, Thales explained that there's basically 4 characters he's looking at to find that substance, to find what is that thing. And he was looking at existence, change, motion, life. And when he was looking for what is the one thing that carries all of those, because if we look at matter around us, we start to eliminate different elements and find that there is only one that carries all of those. So let's explain what that means. The first one, existence. We can see that in life, everything exists in 3 states: solid, liquid, and gas. And when we look at all the matter around us for the whole table of elements, we see that water is naturally in all 3 states. So again, we're talking about time before microscopes, before understanding matter in a much deeper way, and we're just looking around us at what exists. And when you find within nature, with no intervention from humankind, water is the only one that is both ice, liquid, and gas. Next, we look at change. So I think it's important to understand that when we look at nature, we want to look at things that don't have intervention of consciousness, of our conscious scientist intervening within the process. So water, again, is the only one that changes forms by itself. Within nature, water will change between ice, liquid, gas on its own without our intervention. And it's the only substance that does that and has the capacity for change. Next, we have motion. Only water is constantly in movement. Water never stops moving. Whether we see it in the ocean, rivers, atmosphere, water is in constant movement, and it moves on its own. Even within the ocean, currents and movement. And in philosophy today, we do say that if something is moving, either a conscious being put it into movement, or it is itself conscious and moving on its own from a certain reason and a purpose to move from point A to B. So here Thales already saw that early on, that the movement within water is a very important way to distinct water from the rest of the elements. And the last point, life. We can see that all forms of life need water. There is no life without water anywhere. Plants, animal, people. And many different life forms can exist for a long time without food or without nutrition of certain elements. But without water, they all die. So when you look at the world around you, plants, animal, people, it's very clear that all vessels of water are vessels of consciousness, vessels of life, living, growing, moving beings. For Thales, looking at all those 4 characters, existence, change, motion, life, that's what brought him to his conclusion that water is the first principle. And I personally went through that same journey when looking at the architecture of nature, examining plants, animal, people as architecture, and finding that the architect and dweller is water. I can't tell you how excited I was when I heard about Thales and his conclusions, and the fact that the first logical man, the first philosopher, the first person to step away from mythology came to those conclusions just by looking around at life. That is the first conclusion you arrive to before your mind is already, on one hand, maybe corrupted or structured into thinking otherwise, into having certain ways of seeing the world through theories that are not fully proved one way or another. Yet we do have something that is very logical and simple to see as far as the role of water within life itself. And it's strange that even today, when we look at dictionaries or different scientific papers and we ask the question, is water alive? The answer is no. Today, science tells us that there's absolutely no life within water. It does tell us that there's no life without water, but it doesn't tell us that there is life within water, which is not logical, but again, it's something that over time we will find a way to explain and understand better. Thales was trying to explain everything through one explanation. And because of that, because there were different things he got that were wrong at the time, his entire theory was discredited. And that's a big shame that we weren't able to basically separate the pieces and see where he was right with his logic and what things we found out later that were wrong, but didn't take away from the understanding of life itself. For Thales at the time, he was trying to explain something so big, basically how life comes from pure consciousness into being. But he didn't have at the time the understanding of matter that we have today. And for him it was easier to say basically, well, if this world is floating on this ocean, and this ocean has the capacity of change, right? If water can change into ice, into a solid, then it could probably change into different solids. And the earth itself and everything that's on it came from water. And it is water realizing itself into different matter and then animating that matter into the plants, animal, people. Where today, the way we see it is more that there is pure consciousness that is not even matter or water. It's something before everything. And that consciousness realizes itself into the material world and then into all the different elements. So there's something even before water. Water, the way I see it, is the glove on the hands of consciousness. So water is so magical because it's that transition place where consciousness is moving and manipulating matter, which is very close to what Thales saw. But the idea that all of matter came from water, that's something that today we know did not happen, that water doesn't change its form into iron, copper, aluminum, all the different elements that we have. Rather, water is maybe something that I wouldn't even categorize as matter. I would leave it outside of that category. So we have the table of elements, which are mostly passive, and I call it potential consciousness. It's something that has that potential, it comes from consciousness, but in this material world, it was designed and used as building blocks, and they're not active. And then water is the place where the activity comes in. The architect, the builder, the glove on the hands of consciousness. While Thales' theory of matter coming out of water was probably wrong, but his other understanding of nature was not. He understood that all of life and everything that's generated, from seeds to plants to animal, all of them are basically, as he said, moist, wet. Everything depends on the existence and presence of water in order to be alive and for life to grow and keep moving forward. That flow of water was the first element. A seed will remain dry forever and not grow until water shows up, nothing else. That's where his understanding that the first principle is water, that water is that first thing that life is dependent on. Here in Channel Water, we see the world in a very similar way. The only thing that we see differently is that the cycle of water is the cycle of the soul that is moving through matter. And we see how matter, let's say the architecture in our body, the walls, the bones, go back to the soil to being passive. And the water is what flows back to water and continues that cycle. As the water in your body goes back to the river, ocean, clouds, rain, and that cycle goes on. For Thales, everything was going back to water. Everything came from water and dissolved back to water. And that for him was the cycle. And because of that, he also saw all of matter as being something that is carrying life. So the soul for Thales was throughout all of matter, and especially things like magnets, for example. The fact that magnets would move and attract to each other, that movement for him was a sign again of a soul, of some form of consciousness within matter. And we have to understand that at the time, people lived in a world of gods, mythologies, and the understanding of the world was fractured down into many different gods doing many different things. And we just started to understand the idea of mind and matter, the idea of body and soul. And at the time, people didn't even know energy, or as today we can see that, we have matter, you have energy, and you have consciousness, which are three different things altogether. But at that time, they were all combined into one, but then fractured into different gods and different stories of how things happen in the world. Thales did believe, as he said, that all things are full of gods. So basically, everything comes from a certain godly force, or everything comes from somewhere. But for him, the search was for oneness, for, in a way, one God, one body of consciousness, one substance, one element that everything drives from. Thales wanted to find what is the thing that is behind diversity, that generates all that diversity. And we can see that it happened in different places around the world too, as people were trying to find the oneness within life, the something that is unifying all of us and all of consciousness. So as we find a lot of diversity within matter and the building blocks of life, the further we go into first the mind, then the soul, consciousness, over there we find oneness. So one consciousness and infinite amount of matter, diversity, and combinations within the architecture of life, but one architect. Thales was very close to understanding and explaining life in that way, especially if he had more knowledge about matter and if he had microscopes and understood matter better at the time. But Cicero says something about Thales. He says, Thales assures that water is the principle of all things, and that God is that mind which shaped and created all things from water. So he's so close. Here we say that water is the glove on the hands of consciousness of God. So that the operation is happening through the water rather than it's water itself that's becoming everything else. The difference is so small, but the logic and the understanding behind it is the same. As you look at life around you, you see the role water plays within life. Thales also stated that the independent pre-existence of God from all eternity, stating that God, consciousness, was the oldest of all beings, for he existed without a previous cause, even in the way of generation, that the world was the most beautiful of all things, for it was created by God. For us today, it's hard to look at somebody like Thales that talked about gods, talked about a flat earth, and see that his logic was scientific and that his claims had substance to them. So today, when anyone talks about those things, we immediately discredit everything they have to say. But we have to understand that at that time, explanations about earthquakes, for example, were, according to mythology, that, the god Poseidon, the god of the sea, was angry, and that's why there was an earthquake. So understanding that coming out of that world, of telling those stories about mythologies and gods, into the world of explaining, well, continents are floating on water, and there's a physical movement, and that creates the earthquake. Detaching the phenomena from a god, detaching the phenomena from a story, a mythology, was groundbreaking. And that's what we're still doing today with science. And it's still hard to talk about consciousness, even today, when science has went so far to remove anything that is beyond matter. But still, when we look at matter, we see certain activities, especially the conscious ones, that have a deeper source. And that source is still a mystery today, as it was back then. But I find it interesting that as we look at it, it always brings us back to water. And water is that place where there's the most unknown and where the mystery really lies. In today's video, I just wanted to give you a little introduction to Thales, his philosophies, the birth of philosophy out of mythology and religion, the birth of the world of science out of that too, and to see how we're constantly walking towards knowledge and having full knowledge about the world and our role within it. But also it's important to keep our intuition and our logic in check, which philosophy always does. Philosophy keeps us safe from setting knowledge in stone. We can always question everything and look at it from a different point of view. I encourage you to learn more about Thales and his philosophy and his work, and to understand the evolution of philosophy and science out of that world and his role in it. And also to see how certain things have not changed. Our logic and our understanding of the world, when we really clear our mind, is the same, and certain things are the same, and especially when we look at the role of water within this world, or when we try to understand consciousness and our spirit within this world. If Thales was alive today and could have seen the world from a satellite view and had a microscope, I think that his conclusion would still be the same about water being the first principle, about water being the continuum, the source of life, the origin of movement, the architect of nature. He will understand and know that the earth is not flat, and he will understand that water and matter are two different things, and matter is not coming from water, you would understand how magnets work, but that doesn't take away the intuition and logic behind understanding that water is the source of life within all living beings, and more than that, there is no water without life in it, that life is the essence and the character of water. If you have any more questions or you want to see more videos about this subject, let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching today. We'll see you soon.